It's Friday, and that means another edition, number 61 of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. Those of you who watch know the drill. I'm John Zogby, and I'm with my son and partner, Jeremy Zogby. And we go through one or two, possibly three big news events of the week and take a look at it, oftentimes from very different perspectives, but always with a reasonable and respectful tone. With that said, how are you doing, Jer?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing okay. As usual, not entirely sure what to talk about, so I'm just going to jump in. And in the interests, I think, of our being where our listeners and the rest of the world happen to be, I don't have any answers. Here's the question. Are we making progress towards ending the pandemic? There seem to be conflicting numbers that are out there, not only here within the United States, but also worldwide. And so maybe that's a good place to start, because this pandemic has been with us just a tad over a year now, and 540,000 people are dead. So here's the case for why we're making progress. And then you respond, and then depending on how your response is, maybe we'll take a look at the counter argument, how we're not making progress. All right, so on the progress front, this is column A. Clearly, here in the United States, the numbers of people dying that are directly COVID related have dropped substantially. They're still high, but they're not anywhere near the peak or even the downward slide that they were about a month ago. And so that plus the lower numbers of new cases also seem to indicate that there is substantial progress in handling this pandemic. That also holds for most states reporting fewer new cases, fewer hospitalizations, and fewer deaths. The second case is that substantial progress, in fact, incredible progress made toward vaccination. Some of the early to be expected kinks in distribution seem to be, I'm being very cautious, working their way out, and the distribution network is there. Obviously, there are still some supply chain and distribution issues that need to be dealt with. But bottom line is that close to 100 million Americans now have received at least one of the shots. Production and planning and distribution up to 100 million more shots are planning for May 1st appear to be in the works, and a promise, something that couldn't be made before, we'll have to hold the president to it, but a promise that we will be able to enjoy July 4th, not that long from now, together in the public. Those all point to some substantial progress in dealing with the pandemic. Let's deal with that argument first. Anything you agree with or disagree with?
This is a continuous theme throughout this podcast, and it represents the two generations, the differing viewpoints as a result of two different generations, but also where you hang out in the media world. I for one, dabble in both the alternative independent media as well as the mainstream. And so if you look to the independent media, and I think this stuff is also being covered in Reuters and AP, but the AstraZeneca vaccine has been halted in 20 plus countries. So that is a major issue. That is beyond supply chain. That is adverse reactions, serious injuries, and in some cases deaths. And so, because I'm not an immunologist or a vaccinologist, I can't really say what that is, but it seems to be, most likely that the emergency measures that allowed these vaccines to be rushed to market, which normally take, anywhere from 6, 7, maybe even a decade, 6, 7 years to a decade, but instead has been rushed in months. That's to be expected. But to restate AstraZeneca, that a vaccine halted in 20 plus countries. I came across a study in the city of Hamburg at I can't remember the name of the university, but the initials are UKE. And again, it's a university, I can't remember what the K and the E are, but they're looking into the phenomenon of comorbidity and to what extent is COVID causing, singularly causing deaths versus underlying health conditions, especially among the elderly, who tended to be the let's say the demographic who were most likely to die of COVID, but the comorbidity phenomenon, and whether it was heart disease or whether it was respiratory illnesses, whether it was type 2 diabetes, and so on, that's being looked at and that's being paid attention to. And then to me, what was the bombshell is, and I only remember his last name, Boscia, who I believe is either from the Netherlands or from Germany, but he's done extensive work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's a part of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and has worked for GSK, a major vaccine manufacturer. And he's come out in the last week and he shocked the world by saying that mass vaccination amidst the pandemic could have horrific effects, and that the ultimate scenario could lead to even more powerful strains that become resistant, superbugs, in other words. And to me, that's fascinating, coming from somebody, we could say is, no doubt about it, an insider. And so, at the end of the day, it depends, where you're getting your news from. If you're getting it from both the mainstream and the independent, or just one or the other, you can miss a lot of these things. But no doubt about it, that is big news that I think needs to be talked about worldwide. And there's more, but that's a good start.
So was the rush to vaccination, or let's not call it rush necessarily, but the progress toward vaccination, was that not necessary then, in your view?
I don't know whether it's necessary or not necessary. What I do know is that if you look at previous vaccines, which take anywhere from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of extensive research to understand the long-term effects, bringing an entirely experimental vaccine, like Moderna and Pfizer, the mRNA vaccine, for the first time being introduced to the public at large, could have essentially, we're in an unknown situation.
Yeah, no, I get that. The unknown
and so
situation.
I guess the question is, was that communicated to the public? Was it communicated that instead of saying 95% efficacy, well, what was the measurement of 95% efficacy? Was it within 3 months? Was it within a month? Was it within 6 months? What were the potential long-term effects? Some may interpret it that a lot of that stuff was overlooked in the rush to market this because of the fear of the pandemic. And so it just kind of goes back to the notion of science. Science doesn't necessarily have one universal voice. There are conflicting messages, and who's to say one should be shut out? It should be open to public debate.
All right, so you've opened up a number of things here, and for the record, we disagree with each other. Although I learned from you, and I appreciate what you're saying. Look, understood historically anyway, under these kinds of conditions, it has generally taken a long time for vaccines or medications to be developed and to be tested. And under optimum circumstances, you need longitudinal studies. Not short-term 2-month or 3-month impacts to get your metric, but obviously a thorough gestation period, of years, and many more tests. But in this instance, so are you suggesting that a panic unnecessarily may have been created here?
No, I don't think that was anywhere. You mean from the? Can you specify?
Yeah,
what you mean?
I mean that because the comorbidity factor, as you and others have suggested, was not studied sufficiently. That, in other words, there are people who died from pneumonia that may have been COVID related, or may not, or COVID may not have been a major factor, but was listed as a factor and therefore was counted as COVID related. That perhaps the COVID pandemic was blown out of proportion, and that therefore under a false premise, not pretense, but under a false premise, these vaccines were rushed to market. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, and I also wouldn't say that I'm one of the ones suggesting. I'm relaying information that I've heard from the other side. But what it appears to me is that, and this is the phenomenon of, I think, of emergency situations where there is when there are emergencies, there's one camp that says we have to act now, we have to act now, we have to act now. And that's very much understandably so. There's a panic. But I think in emergency situations, there in many cases can also be another camp that can say, well, if we act too fast and we don't really understand the phenomenon, there are unintended consequences. And so I'm just bringing up the other side of it, that we're suggesting, and some were even predicting, unintended consequences, and now it appears to be that that's coming to light. So
just for the record, and I was going to bring this up because we still have column B to talk about whether or not there's progress on this, that in the case of AstraZeneca, which has not been fully approved yet here in the United States, it's undergoing a vetting process, but was seen as a large enough problem through much of the EU that it was put on at least temporary ban. However, the EU we're talking 24 hours now, the EU has now declared that it is safe, and that in fact the blood clotting that was associated with AstraZeneca was, let's not mistake words here or intent with intentions. There were a few dozen cases of blood clotting, but that was not deemed to be, when you're talking about millions of vaccinations, a serious roadblock to the use of the AstraZeneca vaccination. So, in other words, that AstraZeneca has been is on its way to reapproval. If unless I'm missing something from the news, maybe it is back to reapproval.
Well, what I'm fascinated by is, I mean, if I were a European, and I'm sure that there are many Europeans who are going to hold this sentiment, I imagine that seeing, from the vantage point on that continent, 20 plus governments halting it. I mean, in the case of Italy, the CIS policed 400,000 doses because a music teacher died immediately after it. And then seeing, the seizure, and then close to maybe 24 or more than 24 countries halting it. What's the damage to the confidence from the citizen standpoint? And then, within 48, 72 hours, okay, we've got this under control. I'm more fascinated in, is that enough to get the confidence of millions of people to say, well, that was a fluke, we've got it under control? That's a very tight situation.
I'm not going to suggest that when leaders are at war that you necessarily throw caution to the wind. I am going to suggest, though, that it is the training of those leaders that warrant that they be in positions where risks are taken, where there is not sufficient time to be contemplative, to withdraw, to retreat, to hold seminars and so on, that there are real-time or near real-time decisions that have to be made. And I think that this is one of those cases. Certainly the numbers themselves, whether you include comorbidity as a factor or not, that there are sufficient cases worldwide and pretty much everywhere to warrant speedier action than normal. The growth of this virus itself on its own, if left untreated, could be double, triple, quadruple what the impact has been already, and the impact has been serious. But when it came to providing, researching, developing, providing for vaccines, that the time wasn't to wait and say, well, we need 3 or 4 years to vet this and study it. Bottom line is, yeah, there were some problems, sad and unfortunate problems with AstraZeneca, but by and large, I'm one that says you trust. You trust science, especially when it appears to be a worldwide consensus. And worldwide consensus does not mean that there are outliers, that there aren't outliers. It does not mean that there aren't very legitimate and respected scientists who raise doubts, but it is to say that decisions do need to be made under dire circumstances.
Yeah, and I can obviously appreciate that. That in many cases is a historical fact, but it's not necessarily a historical fact in every case. And I wouldn't straw man it, and I'm not saying that you're necessarily doing this, but I wouldn't straw man the argument as, well, let's sit back and debate and debate this over the case of a few years. Although there are scientists who do think that the negatives will outweigh the positives, and I just listed one here, Boscia, who again was with GSK, was with the Vaccine Alliance, was with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, saying that this could be horrific for humanity. And so in that situation where you have powerful voices who are suggesting alternative or counter arguments, we shouldn't have ad hominem attacks. We shouldn't have character assassination. And all too often that happens is that the opposition are straw-manned, their character is assassinated, they're this, they're that label, they can't trust them, they're misinformation spreaders. And so that's not good. But
so let's shift this and go ahead, finish.
No, I was actually going to suggest a shift in the topic, but
Yeah, I was too, but you go ahead, because I'm usually the topic shifter.
Well, I'm interested in foreign policy. I'm interested in, of course, what's going on at the border is a major story, and that actually could warrant an entire episode in of itself. But right now, I think the exchanges back and forth between Putin and Biden is pretty significant, and could very well be worrisome. But do you want me to go first? Why don't you go first?
You go ahead, and then I'll come in with the truth squad. No, I'm kidding.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, going on national television and name calling, I know world leaders do that all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't necessarily think that it's a good thing. Um, you know, I'll be frank. I mean, when you're a billionaire and a politician, when you're a billionaire and a president, I'm about 100% sure you're corrupt. So there's no doubt about it that Putin is an angel. But looking at it from a geostrategic point of view and a foreign policy point of view, I don't think it's a good idea to villainize Russia, especially so early on in a transition, right? Biden is still a transitional president. Um, of course, we have this hostility. It goes back for decades. Um, but the reality is, I'm going to go back to Robert S. McNamara,
Mm-hmm.
who did this wonderful documentary, The Fog of War. I watched that years ago. And one thing that stands out is one of his lessons learned from the Cold War, especially Vietnam, and especially the Cuban Missile Crisis, was empathize with your enemy. So we know that, from the perspective of the intelligence community and the Department of Defense, that Russia is the enemy. Um, but I don't see any empathizing with the enemy. If you look at a map, and this is how Russians would look at a map, actually there's a meme about this. There's a joke about this that floats all over the internet, and it's something like this. It's a map, and it shows all of the NATO bases that are surrounding Russian
Mm-hmm.
borders, and it says, Russia wants war. They're expanding on our military bases. Obviously it's ironic. It's a joke, but it goes back to understanding and empathizing with the other side. You have to understand and appreciate the perspective of Russia, and that not only historically have they been attacked by Napoleon, attacked by Hitler, and beyond. I mean, even going back to the founding of their nation, the Mongols. They are in a fortress mentality, and when they see bases building and building and growing along their border, it's kind of hard to make them look like the sole aggressor. And so when the president goes on television and says he's a soulless killer, yet, look, let's be honest, Biden as vice president oversaw, not necessarily oversaw, but had something to do with Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. And depending on where you stand on that side, these are humanitarian disasters, those three wars. And make no mistake about it, NATO and the United States had a lot to do with that. So that's my perspective.
I'm not going to disagree at all. In fact, we have a tendency to focus, not we as human beings, as policymakers, this country and beyond, we have a tendency to focus on our own national self-interests and the culture that we've created around those national self-interests. And so in the Russian view, while the largest nation in the world geographically sees itself as an expansionist power, it draws that expansionism initially for defensive purposes. It has been exposed. Many of its borders are exposed borders. And you go back to the Mongols and Frederick Barbarossa, and they have a history of being attacked, and history of being attacked with the West not really caring, or even worse, participating in those attacks. By the same token, the United States has been blessed. It has emerged from major wars almost unscathed because of our history of splendid isolation. And yet at the same time, how else do you interpret the settling of the West except by the same means that Russia has expanded the Soviet Empire, the Commonwealth of Nations, and whatever. And for those who are about to say, yeah, but those lands were not populated, oh, they were populated, and check your racist history. They were very populated. Do you ever wonder when you're watching Westerns how the settlers or the cavalry are out in these vast portions of desert and Rocky Mountains and plains, and in view everywhere are Indians? I mean, what does that tell you? It tells you those places were populated,
Yeah.
and that this was very much an invasion. All right. With that said, this was. I agree with you. It was not diplomatic of Biden to do that, but I think it was also to say that Putin is a killer. By the same token, I think that obviously it was a statement on the part of the United States that the United States is cognizant of Russia's moves. I think, especially in the Middle East and obviously the Ukraine, and then the budding war as well that's taking place between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and those sorts of lesser known pockets. But Biden is staking out a different sort of position than Trump, who was seen for whatever reasons, some of which may very well have been personal reasons, to be almost a lackey of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, but again, back to empathize with your enemy. Now, you're right about Soviet expansion, Russian expansion in their history. I would debate Crimea, the most recent. When I lived in Eastern Europe, I knew Ukrainians who were ethnic Russians. And funny enough, they didn't call themselves Ukrainians, they called themselves Russians.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
People from Crimea identify as Russian, they speak Russian. And, an election was held, and of course you could say, well, that was fixed, right? Maybe it was, but the fact of the matter is they historically have seen themselves as Russian. So I don't know if I would classify that as necessarily an imperialist venture, but who knows? But regardless of that, let's go back to, I believe it was George H.W. Bush, who after, the end of the Cold War, said not one finger, referring to no expansion into the former Warsaw Pact countries. And boy, was that promise broken immediately by Bill Clinton. And maybe even it started under HW. So it's still with the Russians today that they're being encroached on. But the other thing that I think was even more disturbing that I can't figure out, and maybe you can help me figure out, because I know that you read a lot about this stuff, and you've been invited to CSIS to speak. So, I mean, maybe you have a better perspective on this, but I mean, it was a couple weeks ago, the president comes out and through the New York Times says something to the effect, now wake me up if I'm in a dream, expect a cyber attack against Russia within 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that to me is bizarro world for many reasons, but I mean, not only just being open about it, it's almost like, well, couldn't that warrant an attack against us? And that raises all kinds of problems. But I mean, number one, how smart is that? Number two, what are the disastrous effects that can have, not just between Russia and the United States, but World War III?
Yeah, and obviously responding to both the major attack, cyber attack that was made by Russia against the United States back in October, but also the report that came out, the intelligence report that came out just in the last 48 hours, indicating Russia's role, not only in the 2016 election, but the election of 2020 as well.
Well, let me just say one thing. Remember, in October, the claim against the solar, it was a solar company. I can't remember.
Solar.
The terminology was likely Russia. We can't
Yes.
base decisions on likely. That's not very intelligent of intelligence. But continue.
No, that's it. I think you'll find that we're not only in agreement, but the United States is skating on some thin ice here, and there's plenty to be worried about. In terms of escalation between the United States and Russia, and geopolitically on the ground, not only in cyberspace, but on the ground as well. There are several hot zones that that can be very troublesome between the two countries here.
I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm going to ask a question because I'd like to end this on solutions. We've talked about issues and problems, but just based on all of your knowledge of history and all of your knowledge of current events, and obviously you're a sought out speaker on American politics, but can even dabble into international affairs. From your perspective, if you were tasked, if you were brought to give a briefing to President Joe Biden about the Russia issue, and you were to give one suggestion that maybe could be the silver bullet issue or maybe not, what would you suggest Biden do in terms of working with Russia or dealing with Russia? I'll leave it broad.
There are many things, but the 1 minute form is after Obama became president, he appointed a commission led by James Baker and George Mitchell, two highly respected Democrat and Republican. And the Baker-Mitchell commission said that a regional conference is essential. Regional conference of all interested players, and of course at the top of the list would be the United States and Russia, to focus on the entire Middle East region. This is before the Arab Spring, but that in other words, we cannot take a piecemeal approach towards the Palestinian issue, towards the Iranian Gulf crisis, towards Yemen, eventually then towards the Arab Spring and the need not simply for democracy, but for economic justice. And so I would say that the time is past due for that regional conference to take place. Hopefully something that would do a whole much better job than the Versailles conference did 100 years ago, which in many ways exacerbated all of these crises in the region and throughout many parts of the world. That's the 1 minute version. We could talk endlessly about that another time, but that's as far as we'll go now.
Is that soft power, essentially?
Well, soft power is a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I was on not only the advisory commission on public diplomacy, but also the CSIS commission on soft power. I was a commissioner for several years, and clearly the United States has military might, although it's scattered and in many ways a bit outdated. But clearly the United States has to go about building its relationships in the Middle East region and handling Russia, as we've already talked about, in a much smarter way.
Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's an emergency.
Otherwise, it's an emergency. Okay, I think that's a busy week.
Absolutely.
Okay. So stay tuned for next week, where I'm sure we'll come up with something. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jerry.
Have a great weekend.
Okay.